I'm Richard Doty. I was assigned as a special agent with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations at Kirtland Air Force Base. I was a counterintelligence officer at the base, and one of my jobs was to conduct counterintelligence operations at the base. And during my time there, my first few months there, I was briefed into a special access program involving the U.S. government's investigation and contacts with extraterrestrial, the visitation of these extraterrestrials to Earth, and the Air Force's involvement with these extraterrestrials. And during this time, I conducted investigations regarding not just the UFO phenomena, but my primary mission, probably 60% of my time was dealt to investigating the UFO sightings and any threats imposed by these extraterrestrials on Air Force or Air Force-related property.
Right. What year did you first get read into the project?
I was read into the project in the summer of 1979. Okay. And the briefing was, it was a special access program. You have a special security clearance to have access to it. And I was briefed into it by an Air Force colonel from Washington who came down and briefed myself and a couple other people into this program.
And do you remember if it had a code name or a project code number?
Yeah, was the initial. How do I say this? Because there's still some classifications involved in this. Sure. I think so. It was the code name that I was briefed into. It was Yankee Black, but that was the program's briefing. It wasn't necessarily the UFO's program. It was just how it was a security code for an access program. Yankee White was access to the White House, and Yankee Black was the access that you would have to get into this program or right into the program.
Right. And what were you told during this briefing, and do you recall the colonel's name?
I'll leave the colonel's name out of it, but the briefing started with the history, U.S.'s involvement with this extraterrestrial, and it started out with a crash at Roswell, but actually, what the crash didn't actually happen in Roswell. Happened closer to Corona, New Mexico, southwest of Corona, New Mexico, and a second crash site that occurred in Magdalena or Horse Mesa out west of Magdalena, New Mexico, which wasn't located at the same time the Roswell crash was in 1947. The crash in Magdalena wasn't located until about 1949.
And did they share with you what they found during that investigation and recovery?
They showed us the movie. They actually showed us, I believe it was a 16-millimeter movie on the recovery. And the narrator of the movie, it was obviously the movie was classified, highly classified. The narrator in the movie detailed when the crash occurred, approximately when the crash occurred in the latter part of June of 1947, and the recovery, showing military personnel at the recovery site, recovering the bodies at the site, and the craft that was at that site. And one live extraterrestrial was found at the site. And we were told that the extraterrestrial went to Kirtland Air Force Base at that time, and then on to Los Alamos for some time. And it didn't explain fully in the movie exactly what happened to that extraterrestrial, although it did explain that it died in I believe it was 1952. But the bodies of the extraterrestrials that were found at the scene were in a deep freeze, placed in a deep freeze, and sent to Wright Pat Field in Dayton, Ohio.
Did they show the actual footage of the craft and bodies? And
Yes.
So what did it look like? What did they look like?
Now, the craft was more or less an oval or egg-shaped craft. It wasn't saucer-shaped.
Mm-hmm.
The creatures were about 4 foot. Some of the creatures were mangled, were heavily injured, and their bodies were torn apart. But 2 of the bodies were pretty much intact, and I'm not sure why. If there was an autopsy, they didn't discuss that. But the creatures were approximately 4 foot. They had didn't appear to have any ears. They had an indentation for the nose, very, very big eyes. They had a really tight-fitting suit. Almost looked like they were nude, but they actually had a very thin but tight-fitting suit on. The fingers had no thumbs, just four fingers. Suction devices on their tips of their fingers, and one of them had a head apparatus on it, maybe a helmet or some kind of an earphone or some type of device that they were communicating with the craft or with something else. And they found a number of different objects in the craft that they used, that they experimented with, and found they had a piece of, they thought was plexiglass. It was a rectangular piece of plexiglass that they kept for years before they figured out it was the energy device for the craft. And then they showed us the recovery of the craft in 1949 in Horse Mesa. And that craft, it crashed at the same time the 47 craft crashed. But because of the remoteness of that location, it wasn't detected until a rancher found it on his property in 49. And they did a recovery project on that craft, but the bodies were decayed. And there wasn't much left of the bodies, but the craft was the same type of craft that was found near Corona. It was an oval-shaped craft, but it had damage to it, just like the one at Corona did. And I think the opinion of the scientists were the 2 crafts crashed for some reason, which was never explained. No, I think nobody has it right. One of the things that is quite disgusting, if you for the people who've ever been briefed in this program, is there's not much out there that's factual. The UFO community disinforms themselves. They provide people go out there and write books, and without any facts, 90% of everybody that writes these books, these authors, had never been in the military, worked for the intelligence community, never had a security clearance, and they're just relying on second, third, and fourth-hand information to write a book, and then basically poison their readers and the rest of the UFO community. And so the July craft actually it crashed in the end of June. The recovery project was into July because it was at the end of June, and people just didn't get it right, and the UFO community didn't get it right. Now there's some people out there that have tried to present the facts, but they've been ridiculed and so their information is not being believed. But just like the Horse Mesa crash in 49, very few people have that factual. They think it was entirely different craft. The craft was exactly the same as the Corona craft, exactly the same. And the damages that they showed in this movie, they showed sketches of the crafts together at some location, and it appeared, if anybody with a logical mind can see that these crafts crashed together. Why they crashed, I believe the Eben, they called this particular entity that lived in Eben. He probably explained but I was never briefed into exactly how he explained that the two crafts crashed. I know it was a lightning storm. It was a storm in that time period when it was when they crashed. But the two crashes have been separated by some people and then discounted by others within the UFO community. And that's what is so disgusting and troubling within the UFO community. That's why I have nothing to do with them anymore. I've tried. I've went to UFO conventions and tried to explain what the truth is, and nobody wants to hear you because they've written a book that says it happened this way, and they're not going to listen to you, even though they really don't know the truth.
Right. Don't bother me with the facts my mind has made up.
Exactly.
I run into it all the time.
Yeah.
So did the craft, can you describe the actual craft more? Did they show enough of it to get any detail of the sense of the size?
It was about 35 foot in diameter across. 35 by, I think, 42 or something like that. The interior craft was, it didn't have any actual levers or flight control systems that we would identify as a flight control system, or avionics that we would identify as flight avionics. Totally unknown devices in the craft, the steering mechanisms. But they eventually, I think, over some time, figured it out, and it was done all by hands. The creatures would put their hands on controls, and they'd have this headset on, and this headset would somehow control or help them control the aircraft. And the avionics were very, very sophisticated avionics that it took us years, I think, to figure it out. And I was never briefed into that, so I can't talk. I don't know anything about what they figured out. But they took the crafts to Wright-Patterson, and at the time, in the late 40s, that was probably the best place to understand or try to figure out. They had the best scientists there to figure out how these crafts flew.
Did the energy device used to kind of like plexiglass or translucent, some sort of translucent object? Did you ever get read into any of the modus operandi of that, or how did they figure out how that worked?
I was not directly briefed in, but at some time in my career, I read a document in Washington that explained the U.S.'s U.S. scientists' understanding of what this was. It was an energy device that used a 0-point energy. That's what they referred it to, as 0-point energy. And it was connected in such a manner that this device could power, from a very small flashlight or a very small watch up to a city. And the power was determined by what the demand on it was. And so each craft had one of these. The craft that crashed in Magdalena, or in Horse Mesa out west, had a larger energy device than the one found in Corona. And I don't think they could understand why, but they operated in the same manner.
Okay. And did they figure out how to apply that into other research projects? Did you find out if this was then studied and put into experimental U.S. prototypes? I
was never briefed in that program. I'm sure they did, but I can't talk about that because I can only talk about what I've done and what I've seen.
Exactly.
But
that's all I want.
Yeah, I was never briefed into that.
Got it. So after this briefing, was there anything else in the briefing that stood out from the colonel?
The briefing pertained to the threat posed, the threat that was imposed by extraterrestrial crafts, and then also briefed on some other alien crafts that had visited Earth. There was 4 types of crafts that they showed us, 4 types of extraterrestrials. And they never explained to us where they got the pictures of these extraterrestrials, but there were actually pictures of these weird-looking creatures that showed on the film that were extraterrestrials from some other location different from where the Ebens came from. One was looking like an insect, had huge eyes, very large head, a small body, they had two different appendages on their arms. They had basically two hands on each arm, and they had several joints in their legs, and they had a bubble type appendage in the front, and a lump or something in the back, and that was one of them. And the other one was
you know how large those?
They were about the size of a human, average human, about probably between 5 foot and 6 foot tall. And the second one was a very tall, thin, very thin humanoid that had long arms. The arms reached down probably to its knees or halfway between their hips and their feet. They had regular hands. Their faces were very, very thin. They were almost human looking, unless you really, really studied them, got real close to them, and then you determined they weren't humans. I mean, you couldn't identify them as human beings. They didn't have any hair. They had cat-like eyes. Their irises were different than that of a human, almost cat-like. And then there was a third creature that was I found this out later, but at the time they just showed the creature, and it looked something like the eben, but it was bigger. It had a bigger body than. But I found out later in a briefing I had in 1985 that was a genetically engineered creature that the ebens made, and that was a briefing in 85 based on an investigation that we were doing.
They felt it was genetically engineered?
They knew it was genetically engineered, and I don't know how. They didn't ever tell us how, but
did they read you into the neural complex with integrated circuits? And
no.
Were there any craft associated with these other species?
Yes, yeah.
What did those look like?
One was a cigar-shaped craft. Mm-hmm. One was, excuse me, I think it was like 60 or 70 feet long and 20 or 30 feet wide, cigar-shaped. Second one was a regular saucer shaped, but it was really, really wide. It almost looked like one of those tops that the kids play with. Really, really wide. And they were puzzled. I remember in the briefing, in the initial briefing, the colonel said, we still can't figure out how this thing flies. So they pictured it. They took pictures of it. They saw it, but I don't know that they ever actually captured one. At least at that point, I didn't know. And they never told us that. And then there was another craft that was very, very small. It was about the size of a Volkswagen, but it was, a saucer shape, but it was, oval shape, almost like the eben, but a lot smaller. It was almost like it was a one-seater type of maybe an observation or a reconnaissance craft. And those are the only crafts that they briefed us that was in the presentation.
And you saw photos of those?
Yeah, they had photos of them, actually, in the film. They showed photos in the film of these creatures, of these crafts. And the film started, you could tell that the film was an old film when it started, maybe in the 50s or early 50s or late 40s. Didn't have a date on it. But then as the briefing went on, it got more modern. The information in it became more modern, and you could see, based on what was shown in the movie, that it was the information was more current than the first part of the film was, and the pictures of these crafts that we saw in the latter part of, and the crafts were in the latter part of the film, was something that I've seen since on TV on the History Channel that other people have taken, like the McMinnville craft. One of the crafts in there looked just exactly like, if you're familiar with the
yes.
I think that was in 51 or 50 or something, back in the 50s.
Right. Did the colonel, or during this briefing and subsequent briefing, did they ever explain to you what the perceived threat was that they were concerned about?
Yes, the threat to number one, the first perceived threat was what were they after? What was it? A reconnaissance? Were these a reconnaissance flight? Were they going to recon before an invasion? Were they going to land and take over some particular facility for their own purpose? Were they short of minerals? Because a lot of what we were told towards the end of the film was that a lot of these crafts later on were seen over uranium mines and other mining areas. And so they're concerned, what are they after? Are they after uranium or turn into plutonium or exactly what they're after? And so our job was to investigate, and determine, was there a threat? And if there was a threat, report it up the chain of command and hope it wasn't a big threat.
It sounds like from their technologies they've gone a little bit past nuclear power, but was there any sense that the advent of all these occurrences had to do with the fact that we had developed atomic weapons? Because Roswell, of course, had the atomic bomb squadron, the only one in the world at the time, and this facility here, and uranium mines, and etc. Colonel Diedrichson, as you know, is one of the disclosure projects, said that every single one of our facilities had reconnaissance of, and was that discussed?
Well, they inferred it that that they were concerned because the way the Colonel put it, and I think this was some of his own feelings at the time when he talked to us later, was that we just had a drop 2 bombs, nuclear weapons on a country. We had a test of that bomb a few months earlier, or a few weeks earlier, in New Mexico, and this probably was observed by these aliens somewhere, whether they were doing reconnaissance back then or how they had figured it out. So they came here to observe and try to figure out what the heck was that. And maybe they didn't have a weapon like that, and maybe they did, and maybe they're concerned about this Earth for some particular reason, or maybe they were after those weapons. And that was a concern because security of nuclear weapons was the number one priority of the United States. Air Force, because the Air Force had a lot of nuclear weapons. One of the primary missions for OSI was protect counterintelligence operations against the threat of nuclear weapons. And Kirtland Air Force Base had a lot of nuclear weapons. And New Mexico had, at the time, like you said, the 509th Bomb Wing at Roswell had the only nuclear-capable strike force in the United States at that time.
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
Right. So were there subsequent briefings, but from the 79 and 1985 ones, were there further updates during your career?
When we were investigating something, we then asked for a briefing on it because we didn't get everything. Mm-hmm. We were given enough to conduct an investigation, have some historical knowledge on what we were investigating. But then when we in 81, I believe it was 1981, there was a scientist who died, an Air Force scientist who passed away, and he had an old Army footlocker full of autopsy photographs, and these autopsy photographs were of the creatures that died in the Corona crash. And so we went out to recover all this stuff. And I looked at these things, and it didn't look like humans to me. I looked at this, and these were actual, you being a doctor, you understand, autopsy photographs. And they were still photographs of autopsies. But they had the organs out. And I had a little bit of medical knowledge, not a whole lot. But I had a little bit of medical knowledge and looked at this, and I said, doesn't look like a heart or doesn't look like a lung. But what we found out was, and true, that these Ebens had just one organ that was made up of the heart and lungs. It was just one organ. And they had a couple different stomachs for different digestive reasons. And they had an organ that would take every single bit of moisture out of whatever they ate and fed the body. So they didn't really have to drink a lot of fluids. And when I found all this stuff, I took it in. I immediately classified it. I asked for a briefing. What is this? Is this human or not? Well, On the bottom of each photograph, there was a case number and a date. And the dates were in the 40s, 47. I think there was September something of 47. And the case wasn't a case number that I recognized. So then I asked, and eventually I got a briefing by a scientist who was a medical doctor. He was from the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in Washington, D.C. He came out, and myself and the other agents that were involved in this, he briefed us. He gave us basically anatomy 101 of an extraterrestrial. And he said, yeah, in fact, these are the autopsy photographs from Corona.
And did they have any further details that they provided them? Maybe the brain or any other organs?
Yeah, the brain.
Reproductive?
Yeah, the brain had I don't remember how many lobes the human brains have, but they had 11 different lobes of their brain. And they had where their spinal cord met the brain. It had two little bulbs on each side, which they could never figure out what they were. It wasn't like ours, and their eyes were very sophisticated. They had the optic nerves, but the optic nerves went into different places in the brain, almost as if the brain was operating. Their eyes were operating at different parts of the brain for some particular reason.
Fascinating.
Yes.
And were there any reproductive organs, or did they get a sense of?
They didn't find. No, I wasn't briefed on anything like that. And none of them were females. So they I think the EBA ones told them that there were females, but there wasn't any females on any of these crafts.
They were all male.
Yeah, they were all males.
Did they have penises? Or?
Yeah, they did. They had a reproductive gland. Okay. They didn't call it a penis. They called it a reproductive gland.
Okay.
It was in the body. And I guess at the time of, it came out, that's what they figured. Their muscles were extremely fibrous. I remember that, especially the leg muscles. They weren't bulky, but they were strong. They were fibered, which I guess gave them more strength than what our muscles. They didn't have ears, but they had a canal with an organ or gland, I think they call it, a little bulb that they think was what they could hear out of. But they didn't have vocal cords like we had. Their vocal cord, they didn't have any. So this another thing that was brought in the briefing was very fascinating to me. When this creature was found, he couldn't communicate other than hand signals. So when he was taken in to Los Alamos, to a medical facility at Los Alamos, and examined. Of course, the physicians didn't know what they were examining. They eventually were able to communicate through sign language. And eventually, somehow, somebody figured out how to do an operation on the vocal cord or insert something in there so it could talk, so it could make sounds. And I don't know how they did that.
Did this living ET share how they communicated with each other?
Through, I guess, well, I wasn't directly ever briefed on that, but I found out some years later that they did it telepathically.
Right. Were there any humans that became adept at doing that with them? Yes,
there was the handler. This the Eben that lived, the Eben one, he had an Air Force captain that was assigned to him, and the captain was a linguist, spoke I don't know how many different languages, but he was also an intelligence officer, and he was able to build a really good rapport with the Eben, and was able to communicate far more communications than anyone else could. And he actually lived with this Eben for I think the 3 or 4 years until it died.
Do you know the names of any of the other agencies or project code numbers or code names that were associated with this subject back in that era?
DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, was intimately involved in it. Everything we sent up through OSI headquarters went to DIA.
Okay.
And there was a guy by the name of Tom Mack. Tom Mack was a project manager in DIA for this project. The projects had various names, and some of the names were just a phonetic name, like Quebec, phonetic alphabet, military phonetical alphabet. The Q, you would say, if you were talking over the radio, Quebec, Q for Quebec. And so we would use phonetic for a particular operation with a district, a number, one of our district numbers, and then a progressive number, we call it, after that. So you might have a Q17, which District 17 was OSI at Kirtland, and then a progressive number for the case number. And but if you went to Pease Air Force Base, I went out to Pease Air Force Base, which is no longer there, but it's in northern New York, is a SAC base, Strategic Air Command Base. They had a very peculiar incident happen up there of a UFO that was flying around their nuclear weapon storage area. It actually landed, and a weapon had been taken apart. The warhead wasn't stolen, but somehow it was taken apart, and there wasn't anybody in this bunker to do that. So they figured, how the heck this happened? So they thought maybe it was a Russian operation or something, and so we went up there, and during this briefing, during this operation, we found fingerprints, but they weren't like our fingerprints. They were very strange-looking prints. Now, if remember when I told you about one of the creatures had two hands on one arm, one appendage, it appeared that something like that had gotten in there. Somehow it got in it, and nobody could figure it out because it's a very secure area. You can figure it. Nuclear weapon storage is very secure. But they had fingerprints. So now we have fingerprints, and that was the first time that we, as a government, actually got extraterrestrial fingerprints.
Do you remember what year that was?
That was in 84. That was 1984. Yeah, it was winter time, so I don't remember if it was late winter or early winter because it was snow on the ground. Of course, upstate New York, it's pretty bad. But I thought that was fascinating. But we never could figure out anything other than that it got in, and it took fingerprints. Now there were many, many, many cases of UFOs spotted around nuclear weapons facility, launch control facilities, Ellsworth Air Force Base, Maelstrom Air Force Base, and then SAC bases that had nuclear weapons. Wordsmith, yes, Strategic Air Command bases. Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Colonel Dietrichson said virtually every facility.
Yeah.
Had been.
Yeah. I read a report where almost virtually everything was, but some of them were more intrusive than just the security forces seeing something flying around compared to creatures found inside an area. And we had that at Kirtland in 1980, where security police at Manzano complex, which was where the nuclear weapons were stored, saw these strange lights out of Coyote Canyon, which was east of the complex, the nuclear weapons complex, and something landed. And so I conducted that investigation, which was extensive investigation, which led into the Paul Benowitz incident.
What was that all about? What actually happened with that?
Paul Benowitz, or the...
Well, both.
Okay.
I've seen some of the documents about the Coyote Canyon event, and also an earlier one, or around that time, where one of your security officers saw a disc
right
out on the...
Actually, one of the security officers from Sandia Laboratories, they had their own security, was checking, it was driving around on a graveyard shift sometime after 2 o'clock in the morning, and saw a craft land at a bunker. But the bunker didn't have anything in it, but the craft landed. And when it landed, all the electronics in that vehicle shut off. His engine shut off, his portable radio stopped transmitting his portable radio and the vehicle stopped. For as long as that craft was on the ground. When the craft took off, everything came back on. And so I investigated that. All we found was that something landed there.
Was it on base radar?
No radar. I checked it. The first thing I did was checked with FAA. And we had also at Kirtland, we had at that time it was pretty a secretive unit that scanned every single frequency that could possibly be generated in and around the base, radio frequencies. And so I went to them and I said, hey, did you guys pick up any strange frequencies on this particular time frame? Nope. I said, okay, I went to FAA, let me see your printouts for this night. Nothing. So then I thought, well, are these guys making this up or what? Well, then the security police inside Manzano, I interviewed them separately, and they told me the exact same story. So I thought, it just makes too much sense to be a fantasy or hoaxing. So we investigated, but we could never find anything regarding that craft. But shortly after that, Major Ernie Edwards, who was the commander of the 1608 Security Police Squadron, the security Air Force security police that guarded Manzano, came to me and said, I got a phone call from a guy by the name of Paul Benowitz. He lives right outside the base. He lives in Four Hills, which is a housing community just on the other side of the base perimeter. And he told me he's seen all sorts of strange lights around Manzano. So I said, oh, that's strange. And so I started checking into it, and we found out that Paul Benowitz owned a business right outside the main gate of Kirtland, Thunder Scientific Laboratories. They made humidity sensors for submarines. So he had a government contract, and he had security clearance. So I went and paid him a visit, asked him about what he saw, and he started telling me all sorts of stories about what he saw and what he did and what he thinks they are. So we conducted an investigation just to make sure this guy wasn't a Russian spy. He wasn't, doing all these things. His house was literally just a few feet from the base perimeter. I mean, his backyard bucked right up to the base perimeter, and he had all this sophisticated. Now he was a physicist. He had all this sophisticated equipment on his patio, his upper bedroom patio, that was pointed towards the base, and that's what we were concerned about. So we conducted an investigation on him, not only us, but National Security Agency, because he actually tapped in, and this was classified at one time, I don't believe it is classified anymore. He was tapped in to a National Security Agency, an NSA project that was going on base, and which he shouldn't have been able to figure it out, but he did. Very smart guy. So we had to figure out how we're going to get him away from what he was doing. And so we started slowly convincing him, or not really convincing him, but just giving him the idea that this might be just UFOs, extraterrestrials. And he ran with that. And I know I had a lot of criticism about that. I fed him all this disinformation, and I made him go crazy. But Paul thought a lot of this up on his own. I didn't have to. It wasn't very difficult for me to convince him what he was seeing. He just told me it's UFOs. Years later, I became friends with him. Years later, after I got out, he still owned it. I tried to explain to him that what he saw wasn't, but he would never believe me. He eventually went crazy and he died some years later. But some of what he was seeing was he took pictures of strange-looking lights in orbs. And, in fact, I sat, and not just me, Jerry Miller, who was he had been a Project Blue Book investigator some years before, and he was in the intelligence staff at Kirtland, not with OSI, but with another agency. Him and I sat in a room, probably not any bigger than this, with really tall ceilings. And Paul was sitting, and we just had dinner, and we came in, and we had some coffee, and the lights were down. In fact, none of the ceiling lights were on. We had just some table lights on. And we were talking. It was 8 or 9 o'clock at night in a winter night, and he says he was explaining to us what he was seeing, and all of a sudden we see this orb up in the corner of his room. And I looked at it and I watched it. Nobody else saw it at first, and I kind of elbowed. There was 3 of us there. It was me, Jerry, and another agent by the name of Steve Atzett. And I hit, and Jerry looked up and he said, and we didn't say anything to Paul. And then started flying around the room, and then, of course, Paul saw it. He said, well, there it is. We looked around like, what the heck is this thing, you know? And so we watched it for maybe 20 seconds, and it disappeared. And went right back to that spot. Well, Jerry thought that it was created by Paul. And Jerry confronted him. He said, Paul, what did you just do? Paul said, no, I didn't do anything. He said, can I look and can I check things out? Yeah, go ahead. Well, Jerry's a scientist too. He looked all over, went up to his room, couldn't find anything that could have generated something like this. It was a ball of light with like little sparklers around it. Mm-hmm. And he says, that's the aliens. Mm-hmm. That's their reconnaissance. That's how they keep an eye on me. And a few weeks later, we were in his house without him being there. Now, a lot of people are saying we broke in, we surreptitious entry. He gave me the key. Paul gave me the key, told me to keep my eye on, if you ever want to go in there, here's the key. So we didn't get any search warrants or anything, but we went in there and we saw a real small orb, not the same size we saw earlier, real small orb that burned a hole through his ceiling. Through his wall, from one room to another. And when we came back a couple of weeks later, we told him about it, and that burn hole was still there. Oh. So at first, we thought Paul was just hallucinating, you know. But the more I looked into this, there was something to this. He was actually photographing extraterrestrials. Not so much of a creature or but of their reconnaissance or their small orbs that they used to conduct experiments on humans. And he had I don't remember how many, but he had a whole group of pictures that I told him, the next time you take any pictures he had a Canon 35 millimeter, one of those, well, at that time it was new. He had a Canon 35 millimeter, and I told him, I said, if you ever take any pictures of UFOs, don't develop them. Let us do it. And he said, okay. So he calls me one day. He says, got a whole roll of 32 or 30, whatever many's in one of those rolls of photographs of these UFOs that I took over at the base. So I went out, picked them up, took them over to our secure photo lab, gave them to our secure developer and said, hey, develop these. And I stayed there, watched, wait. I said, I wanted some 3x5s and, 8x10s and whatever you can. So, an hour later, however long it took, he comes out with them. He says, what the hell are these things? And they're oval-shaped crafts flying above planes that were landing at, now Kirtland Air Force Base shares a field with Albuquerque International Airport. So planes coming in, these things would fly right over top of them and then veer off.
Were these more like orbs, or were they structured?
No, they were structured. And I can't remember how many photographs there were, but they were structured structured crafts. And we had them blown up. The photo guys could do a lot. And we had them blown up, whereby these crafts were about as big as the Corona crafts. And they were exactly, absolutely. Details, struts, the bottom of it. Well, there was one particular one, and these were color photographs, showing a blue trail coming out of the bottom of the craft, which is probably the energy device. And we sent them all up to headquarters, and I don't know whatever happened to them.
Were they seamless?
They were seamless, yeah. Seamless. Yeah.
And did, whatever happened to these photos, or were there any videos, or is it all photographs?
No, all photographs. He never did any videos. Okay. No. Now, he didn't do a video, but we had a video that was brought to us at the base of this guy who lived in Placitas, north of Albuquerque, lived in the mountains. He was retired Air Force. I believe he was a pilot. And he had a video camera setting up, and he was watching animals. He lived in a remote area, and deer and elk would come up to his back area, and he was pretty much filming that. He was a wildlife amateur photographer. But one night, he heard a noise, went out, and this craft hovering right over his backyard, and he took a video of that. It was about 28 seconds or something like that before the craft took off. And that is the only video of a legitimate video. We took the video, the camera, and everything, because you always want to analyze all this stuff together. And we sent up to headquarters. They sent him a check back to pay for that camera because they weren't going to give him that camera back. And they were going to give him... And he wanted copies of that, but he never got that back. They classified it. Whatever happened to the stuff we sent up, I don't know.
Where did you send it to specifically?
OSI headquarters.
Office of Special Investigation.
Yeah, Air Force Office of Special Investigation. At that time, it was at Bowling Air Force Base, headquarters at Bowling. We sent it to headquarters at IVOE, which is the counterintelligence location, and then they would send it over to NSA. And the only reason I know that was years later, after I retired, I was I joined a pretty closely knit group of former and retired intelligence officers, and we get together every year. I haven't attended every single year, but out of 25 years, I probably attended 20 of these reunions or get-togethers, and normally they're after or before the UFO convention at Laughlin. Well, it used to be at Laughlin, now it's in Arizona, and we'd sit down and talk. We just sit down and talk about in a secure, kind of a semi-secure place, and talk about what we know. And that's why I learned a lot from them, because they were briefed in programs I wasn't briefed into. And one of the intelligence officers was from NSA. And when I first met him in probably 94, 95, and I had never met him before, I didn't know him before, he said, I always wanted to meet you because you and I were on the same case together. I said, what case? He said, Paul Benowitz. I said, what do you mean, Paul Benowitz? He says, yeah, we interviewed him too. So they were investigating, and we were investigating, and we didn't know they were investigating. One particular night at Paul Benowitz's house, it was rainy night, winter, kind of fall. I was there, and Jerry Miller was there, and Paul was showing us different things. And Paul came to me and he said, you see that house across the street? The front of this house. I said, yeah. He said, you see those lights in that upstairs window? I said, yeah. He said, they're not supposed to be there. I said, what do you mean? He said, the house is vacant. I said, I said, I wonder who's over there. So I got a gun, and so I go down and I snoop around, and I see the two vehicles parked hidden in the backyard. One's actually in a yard. So I get the license numbers off these vehicles. And the next, I didn't want to go in. I figured, well, maybe they're buying a house or whatever. So the next day, I ran the plates, and they come back to a rental company out of Hertz, I think it was, out of Denver, and they were rented on a government credit card. So I thought, okay, now go ahead. I don't know, a week or 2 weeks later, we were there at the same time, and we see these lights. Well, these lights are, you can tell, camera lights, the old red lights coming out, seeing that there's cameras pointed over here. I said, I'm going to get them this time. So I call Albuquerque police contacts I had, tell them what I had, and tell them somebody come over there. And they come over, and we confront these two guys. And they had to tell us that they were special agents, and they rented this place. That's about all they said. So I knew.
Did they say what agency? Or?
No, they didn't. And APD was, I was off base. I didn't have much jurisdiction there, so Albuquerque Police Department had to, I was just relying on them. They ID'd them. It was confirmed that they rented the place, so I was left at that. But this agent I met years later told me, he said, we investigated that one. We investigated the abduction up at Springer. I didn't know this. So NSA was intimately involved in this stuff too.
Do you know any other agencies or any of these other gentlemen you've met with?
DIA, of course, CIA. We have quite a few members of our group from the CIA. They weren't. They didn't do any field work because the CIA couldn't do that, but they were relying on a lot of information that we were feeding them, and they were doing analytical studies of what they had, but the FBI, of course, was involved in it. They found a box, a cylinder, I should say, not a box, a cylinder on the Ebencraft that had been analyzed at various locations, and Sandia had it. And in 1984, President Reagan came to Sandia and was going to be specifically briefed on this. And I happened to be part of the security detail. And I was in the room when they was explaining this to him. And this cylinder they had a electron microscope view of it, or however they figured out how to X-ray it or whatever they did to it. But they had cutouts of it and a presentation on an overhead projector, and they were explaining to the president what they thought these things did. And it was a multi-purpose avionics device that was also a navigation device for them. And so that's really the only technology that I've ever learned or heard that Sandia was involved with.
Do you know any further extent to which President Reagan was being read into these various projects or information?
I was told one of our members of our former intelligence group was a Secret Service agent. He was a Secret Service agent for some years, and then he went over to the CIA. And he told us that one of the most fascinating things about Reagan was he believed, and he was briefed. He didn't see it or know it, but he knew of others, Secret Service agents, that told him that when he took office on January, whenever it was, 20th or whenever, of 81, he immediately asked for a briefing. Before the Iran, we still had hostages in Iran. Before the Iranian, he even addressed that issue, he says, I want to be briefed on everything we have on UFOs. He sat in the Oval Office and said that. And they said, yes, Mr. President, we'll do that. So he knew, he was never there when he was briefed, but he knew of it. I went to Washington to get a award for something I did, which is still somewhat classified, and I met the president. I never talked to him about this subject, but he knew something because he said to me, I know you work on some very interesting things out there. And that's all I said. We didn't go, I didn't have a whole lot of time. We were in the Oval Office for, maybe 2 minutes or 5 minutes, whatever it was. And he gave me something, and he gave me presidential cufflinks. But and I knew I knew what he was talking about. He never actually said anything, but I knew that he knew, which was nice because you recognize, you think, wow, what you're doing, what I'm doing out there is being briefed all the way up. There was a UFO cover-up live that was aired in October of 1988. I don't remember what channel, but and a year before, in August of '87, myself, Dr. Kit Green, Dr. Hal Puthoff, Ernie Keller-Strauss, Carl Dale, several of us, and Robert Collins went to Dayton, Ohio, and had a meeting in a room. And this producer who produced the UFO cover-up live was there, and he wanted to interview us all. And most of them said no. I said, well, what do you want to talk about? He said, I want to talk about this UFO thing. I said, I won't do it on camera. Well, we sat down in a room, in a hotel room to do the interview. He interviewed me. Well, he gave me a list of questions first, and he said, "Read the questions. Do you have any problems with any of those questions?" I said, "No, I don't have any problems with it." Well, yeah, actually there were a few that I said I can't talk about this and this and this. I think 3 or 4. Anyways, he interviews me. There was one cameraman and him, and he said he would turn the camera off and say, "Can you actually elaborate more, or can you?" What he was trying to do was tell me what to say, and I told him right away, "I'm not going to play your games. I'm going to tell you what I know and what I did. I'm not going to tell you about anything else. I'm not going to tell you anything classified. I'm going to tell you about the Kirtland incident and about what I saw, but that's it." So he put me on back, and maybe another 5 minutes. Wasn't much more than that. And he started that again. I said, "You know what? I'm terminating this." And I walked out of the room. Now, on the UFO Live, they have somebody that they claim to be me, and the beginning of it, the first probably 30 seconds, is in fact me, it blacked out. But everything else was dubbed in. Somebody else was talking for me. And that really upset me. And of course, then they say, "Well, you were live. You were there live." Impossible. I was going to the State Police Academy in Santa Fe during that time period. I started at the State Police Academy in 1st of August and graduate until December. On that particular night, I was isolated inside that dormitory and not even able to watch the let alone being on it. So that was all a hoax. That was all made up. And who dubbed for me? I think it was Robert Collins, to tell you the truth. But and I'm almost positive that was him. And by the way, Robert Collins and I are not friends at all. Absolutely not friends. He published a book in 2006 with my name on it that I had absolutely no input into that book.
Good enough.
So people who say, "Well, you wrote a book," I didn't write any book. I gave him information to put in the book. About 20% of what I gave him went into the book, and the rest of it never went into the book. And that book right now, I'll swear to it that there's probably about 20% that is factual in that book, and there's probably 40 or 50% that's speculation, and then there's the rest of it is absolutely lies. They're hoaxes. I spent a number of assignments to Nevada, and I know that they were reverse engineering. I was never actually briefed on it, but common sense can tell me that this craft over here isn't something we made, or it's based on something they designed. The only exception to that is the Cash Landrum incident in 1980. I know for a fact, I was involved in that. I know for a fact that craft was piloted by Air Force pilots. It was based on a extraterrestrial craft that we'd had, and it was reverse engineered, but the propulsion system failed, as a malfunction in some manner, spurring out radioactivity, and I know that for a fact. But that's the only reverse engineering, other than the cylinder that at Sandia. I understand that was reverse engineered into the 117. I was at the Nevada test site, which is now the Nevada National Security Site, what you call Area 51, which was at that time Det-3 Test Center. It's Area 51, but it was at that, when I was out there in the 80s, it was called Det-3 Test Center out of Edwards. There was a detachment of test personnel from Edwards Air Force Base assigned to Area 51. And Area 51 is just a plot on the map based on the Nevada test site, all the different areas within that. So, but everybody calls it Groom Lake Complex. Actually, there's 2 different locations out there. There's the test site, there's the Det-3 site, and then there's Groom Lake. That's 2 different sites. People are sometimes confusing it, thinking it's the same. And then Papoose is an auxiliary site that actually has the underground entrance.
Have you been in that?
Absolutely, I've been through the whole site. Yep, I spent 9 months out there as a counterintelligence officer. We had a facility at the Area 51 that would blind. We would shoot a laser up, and blind the Soviet satellites as they came over, blind their cameras so they couldn't photograph anything. And not only did we blind the Russians, we would blind anybody else's satellites that would come over. So it's very difficult to get actually photographs during that time period of Area 51. And now I don't know that they have that out there anymore. I've been out for a long time.
What year was that you were?
81 and 85.
And when you were out at that facility, did you see any man-made, sort of based on reverse engineered objects?
Yeah.
That were used, what might be called electromagnetogravitics or anti-grav type systems? I saw one, what I would refer, nobody actually told me it was an anti-gravity craft, but the way it was operating and the way it could lift up by itself, we watched it, it had to be. I don't know what else. I'm not a technical guy, but I could look at it, and just common sense tells me this thing was anti-gravity. Now, but I think that craft was an actually alien craft. I don't think that was a reverse engineered. There's two different complexes out there. There's one that I believe Lazar was talking about with the alien crafts, and then there's an entirely different area for the reverse engineering craft. They're not together at all. They're not in the same hangar. They're not next to each other. They're in different locations. The underground crafts, the underground facility housed the extraterrestrial crafts. The above ground facilities and the far end of the complex housed the reverse engineered aircraft. They had the bodies of all sorts of different types of crafts that they were manufacturing or testing that he put together and try to fly it. Had a lot of crashes out there. So a lot of these things didn't work, but they had those. But I know I read a book where it says everything was in one hangar and that's not true. They were all separated, and they had different people. It was compartmented. They had people over here dealing with those extraterrestrial crafts, and they had people over there that were dealing with the reverse engineering craft. Now, the material, the information came through a third party, bunch of people, scientists here, who would feed it out to there. Those people didn't have access to them, and they didn't have access to the other one. Did you ever see any of the ET craft when you were there in the underground?
Yes. I saw two. The one that defied gravity, which no one ever told me it was an ET.
Can you describe it?
It was a oval shape. It wasn't very big. It was probably 10 feet by 20 feet. It wasn't very big. It had, I think, legs or landing gear that we had put on it because they didn't fit the structure of that craft. And it had these portholes that were almost fluid-like. You look at it and it looked like you're looking through water, if you know what I'm talking about. And I never saw the inside of it, but I only saw the outside. And I saw another craft, a huge craft, that was in the Papoose complex. When you first go down into it, the first bay area on the right-hand side, huge craft, probably 100 foot by 100 foot. I was never told what that was, but it looks like an older craft that had crashed, and because there was damage on it. But the skin of it and everything looked strange. Didn't look like something we would have built.
Right.
Those are the only ones that I could.
And were there any either living or deceased ETs?
I never saw any. I saw supposedly a closed circuit camera. I was sitting in a building, and there was a closed circuit camera filming one in another facility, but I never actually saw one face to face. The contractors. E-Systems, Johnson Systems, Sandia, Livermore, Los Alamos, Tektronix was out there, GE, Motorola. Motorola had a huge facility where they were trying to check on their communications, how their communications worked.
How the ET?
Yeah, ET communications worked. Those were the ones I can remember. Yeah, Eden Gigi ran the place, and Gene Laskowski was the security chief for EG&G, and he always calls himself the security officer but he wasn't the security officer. I always let him say that, but he wasn't really a security officer, but he was their security officer, and he was briefed into a lot of things. He knew a lot, as Paul McGovern. I don't know if you know Paul McGovern, but Paul McGovern was the site security chief for Area 51 from 77 to 91. He was there the whole time. He's retired now. Lives in Washington, Maryland, Landover, Maryland. I think I gave you his name to somebody. I gave their names to try to contact him. He might talk.
Yeah.
In 1980, I was at Wright Pat for a briefing on something entirely different. But while I was there, I asked to be briefed on something that was related to this, and I was taken over to a facility, an underground facility. You walk down steps, a ramp, and a huge underground facility. Although I didn't actually see it, I was told later, not by Collins, but by another person, Ernie Kellerstrauss, that they had alien bodies down there. Now, I never saw them when I was there, and I was only there once at Wright Pat, down in that facility. So what Collins talked about, those tunnel complexes, they probably are real. I mean, they probably had tunnels down there, and I was told that. In fact, I read something in a classified manual once a few years later about them.
Right past
Right
the
Pat.
underground.
Yeah, underground facility. Yeah, you go in Papoose, you go down the ramp. It's a circular, no, actually like a horseshoe, and there's branches off each one of those. There's certain areas. It goes all the way around to the main cantonment area of Area 51, and it comes out on the southeast corner of the southwest corner of Area 51 near Hangar 7. It comes out of there, but along the way there's elevators, and there's compartmented shafts that if you don't have the right badge, you can't, and they're all exchange badge systems, that you can't get into some of these. You only get into certain ones. Like I was saying before, if you're working on the alien craft, you're not going to be you're not going to be working on the other craft. So,
the man-made.
Yeah, the man-made crafts. Yeah.
Have you been exposed, or did you come across in your career and your network the false INW or the deceptive indication and warnings projects related to this?
Yes.
And what did you find out about those?
That's pretty hush. I don't think I should talk about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why when I briefed the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, that was the main subject.
That is, that's very sensitive. Yeah, it's very sensitive. Yeah.
Extremely.
Yeah. So we'll just pass that question on.
That's fine. That's perfectly fine.
The Soviets were just as curious about the phenomena as we were, and that one of the essential, we call them essential elements of information, which you ask a spy. Some things that the government says you have to ask these spies to get this information. One of the first things that the Soviets will, if I'm trying to recruit you, and you're in the Air Force or the military, is what does the government know about UFOs? I want to know. We want to know. The KGB wants to know, and that's something that's fascinating. And so when we recruit a Russian, we ask them the same thing, and then they tell us, oh, the KGB knows this, and so that's something that was fascinating to me, that the Russians were just as interested as we were, and probably just as involved. I was involved with the Germans on the subject when I was stationed in Germany. The BND, the German equivalent to the CIA, the BND, Bundesnachrichtendienst is what they call them in German. But only one particular incident that happened in around a nuclear weapons storage area where something entered it, cut a fence, got in, didn't actually get into a bunker, and that's something that we briefed, but we could never connect it. Although there was a sighting of a UFO over it, but we could never connect them. That was the only interface I had with with Germans. Well, I think the most convincing case that I've ever even been involved with has never ever been made public, and that was the incident up in Utah some years ago. There was a guy that lived in a remote trailer just outside Dugway Proving Grounds, and he was a photographer. He'd worked as he was in the Army as a photographer, and he retired from the Army, and he went to work for. No, I'm sorry, he didn't retire from the Army. He just got out of the Army, and he went and worked for Dugway Proving Grounds as a photographer. He was never married. He was an orphan. He lived by himself in this single-wide, probably 14-foot by 80-foot trailer. He had built some sheds and stuff around it. OSI at Hill Air Force Base called me and said, "We got this guy that lives in this remote area up by Dugway that sent us all these photographs of UFOs." He said, "And we don't really have anybody up here that's," and this is like 84, latter part of 84 or first part of 85. "We don't have anybody up here that can really, talk to this guy intelligently. Could you come up here?" Because they didn't have a 9Q. A 9Q is a OSI designation for somebody that investigated these things. So I went up there. I talked to my boss. He said, "Yeah, go up there," or whatever you want to do. I went up there, flew up. We went out and visited this guy. This guy was not a very intelligent person. He had a lot of common sense, but not well educated. He only went to 8th or 9th grade, but there wasn't anything he didn't know about cameras to take pictures. He learned this all on his own. I mean, the Army taught him, but then for years at Dugway, he took pictures of things out there. He showed us a book of all these photographs and these creatures. And we were saying, "Where did you get these things from?" He said, "They land out here." He said, "They land out here?" I said, "Well, when did?" He said, "Oh, they left a long time ago, but they come here and landed for years." I said, so I asked him to tell me the story. And he tells me that in 68, the latter part of 68, he came home from work. It was a fall day. He goes in, makes his meal, and all of a sudden he hears some noises. He has a cat that ran around crazy. And he goes outside and he sees this craft landing in his backyard. And he went in and got his camera. Of course, being a photographer, went out and took pictures. And creatures came out. He took pictures of the creatures. And he has these pictures there.
What did they look like?
They looked exactly like the Ebens. Mm-hmm. They were Ebens. I mean, they never talked to him. But he said, well, they didn't talk to me with words, but they talked to me in my head. He said, I could understand then that they were having problems understanding me. And he gave him all these gifts that he had. And at first I thought this was a setup. Honest to God, when I got there, I thought this is too real to be it. It can't be real. And I tell the guy, the OSI agent from Hill, I said, is this a setup or something? Or this guy had movie props? Or this isn't real. He said, why are you saying that? I said, because it looks too real to be real. He said, no. He said, I don't know. He said, we've never been out here. So he showed us everything. And the contact lasted from about the 60s, late 60s, until about 75, 76. And then they told him they were leaving. And they gave him these gifts. And they're star-shaped. There's some of them that were like bronze statues and little models of things. And he said, they gave me, these are gifts they gave to me. I said, one of the questions I had was, why are you telling us now? After all these years, 7 years or 8 years, whatever it was, why are you telling us now? He says, I'm dying. This guy was a chain smoker. I bet you he smoked 5 packs of cigarettes a day. in an interview, he probably went through a carton. And he said, I'm dying. He said, I'm not going to live for another six months, but I got to do something with all this stuff. He said, and I figured it, you might as well have it. The Air Force might as well have it. So we sent the flag up, and then we got truckloads of people coming down, NSA, CIA, to review all this stuff. We actually had they contracted a company to come down with a moving van to move all this stuff, package it in a unique manner, because they don't know if this stuff is setting off a signal or. I never thought of that until one of the technical people up in Santa Fe, or up the headquarters, said, in Washington, said, you know what? These things might be bugged or something, or radioactive, or so they took it all up to headquarters, and I don't know.
How many objects were there?
Oh gosh, there were probably 24. I don't know exactly, probably at least 24. Some of them were just objects that they were made of. I don't know what material, but you couldn't really figure out what they were. I mean, obviously meant something to the Ebens, and because they gave them, to him, and thinking that it was something meaningful. And so they packaged all that stuff up and took it to headquarters, and I never heard anything about it. And I've never read or seen anything on the internet about this case. Now, I think George Knapp has. I think somebody mentioned it to George Knapp some years ago. Art Bell sent me a letter once, some time ago. Not a letter, I'm sorry, email. And he asked me about the Utah case. And I'm not sure which, I sent him back saying, which Utah case? And he never responded to me. So,
do you know if this gentleman's name?
His first name was James, and he had a very funny last name. It's like a Polish name. Zadowski or Zadorski or something like that. He was a Polish origin. I knew that, and but he was originally from. He grew up in a orphanage in Northern California, but I guess his mother and father came to the West from they immigrated Poland to the United States, and then they went west to California, and I don't know, somehow they died, and he was 3 or 4 years old, and I don't remember how old he was.
Do you recall what these objects look like? I mean, just a few of them, the ones.
Some of them were shaped like a heart, a bronze heart, with some calligraphy inside of it, and some of them were just statues of, almost like ceramic statues. Of something, maybe a god or something. You couldn't really explain. They were small. Some of them were this big, and some of them were real big. And there was another one they gave. He had was a wreath, almost like a wreath, and there were different symbols around this wreath. And in the back of it, they had these appendages that came out, maybe to put it on a stand or something. I could never figure it out, I'm sure. And I only saw them when one time that he showed them all to us, and then when we came back to package everything up, to send them up. So they're up in CIA or DIA or someplace. Be interesting to. I'm sure they've been analyzed
as well.
Yeah.
Were the photographs daytime of the craft?
Oh yeah, all of them were daytime that I can remember, and they were as clear as you can ever. And he took pictures inside the craft. These are pictures inside the craft.
What did those show?
Where they showed instrument panels, showed a screen, a huge screen with maybe the universe or star charts or navigational charts or something like that. And they told him he had this chart, and this is we were leaving the first time when he said, "Oh, I forgot to show you this," and he went into a chest he had, and his house was a horribly maintained house, and he finds this. It's hard to explain it. It's like a laminated paper that has these lines through it. And he unfolded it. And he said, oh, this is where they came from. Well, there's no references on it. So you know, where is this? He didn't know. He said, but this is the chart they gave me. And that's the only thing that we actually took back that day with us. And then we, of course, came back later and get everything. And I don't know what they ever figured out. They don't ever tell us much after that.
It goes up.
Yeah, it goes up and never comes down.
Did you ever hear where, I mean, there's all the UFO lore, which I discount, but where some of these ET species were from, what star systems?
The only one that I know for a fact that I read later was Zeta Reticuli. I don't know. Zeta Reticuli. Yeah, Zeta Reticuli.
But there was a species from.
Yeah.
And that
was
from
Evans.
An official source.
Yeah, that was from official source. Now, there's a lot of people within our retirement group, a lot of speculation on different star systems and close star systems and things. But officially, that's the only one I know.
Had you heard of any the projects that deal with ET simulations? What I'm referring to here, there have been some contact events. The one you're referring to, I have sources, was actually not ET, but was, if you will, a staged event by military or special operations to look ET because this woman had seen something classified. Have you heard of those sort of operations?
Yeah, but
well, this is
I'm not sure
the
if
false INW.
Yeah, right. We did do that. Yes, OSI did that. There was a special group out of the 7602nd Air Intel Wing at Fort Belvoir that came out and did that. They had these people that had maybe some sort of defects, anatomical defects that were brought in to fool people into thinking they're aliens. Yeah, I can't give you any specifics because the program is still classified, and they probably still doing it. I wouldn't doubt it. They were still doing it.
Yes, I've interviewed a number of men in those special operations. Programs.
Yeah, there was a special, a highly classified operation that occurred in Tacoma, Washington, in I'm saying maybe 86 or 87. That was exactly. It was at the a naval base in Seattle. I think it was Whidbey Island Naval Air Station. I think, but anyways, with Naval Air Station up there, where these civilians got onto the base and got into something, and they saw something they weren't supposed to see, and this group came out and went into their home and scared the dickens out of them and
staged an alien event.
Exactly. It's very sensitive. Very sensitive. Yeah, that and some of the other things that we did in recruiting people. We one of the things that you want to do to protect a base is recruit people outside the base to report into the base. So when I was at Kirtland, we had I didn't do this, but we had a whole group of we call them swindlers who could recruit anybody, and they went out and recruited primarily press people because they're the ones that are going to know first. So every news agency, every television, radio station in the Albuquerque or Santa Fe area had our snitches in there. So we knew, and we paid them. We paid them good money. One of the reasons you get the people is you pay them, and that was controversial. That was somewhat controversial.
Do you know of national media that have had?
Oh, yes, yeah. I'm not going to name them, but we had one. We had one out of, or she she was recruited out of a local station here in Albuquerque, and then she went on to a national NBC, and she was still. She told us everything. She was. We didn't handle her. Somebody closer to, I think she would say out of Washington handled her, but she was. She would tell us things that were going to happen, and yeah.
Were these also assets that could help stop stories from coming out?
Yes. Yeah, and it wasn't just UFOs. It was anything that pertained to Air Force or military or the security of a base or spying or anything like that. If they heard something they thought would be interesting and we needed to know, they'd let us know.
And the other way around, that they would help, you had people who could help stop it from being broadcast.
Yes, yep. Yeah, the high-level producers and directors, yeah.
And how were they paid so that it wasn't?
Cash. Yeah, you pay. What you do is you make them sign a form and you tell them, you got to report this to IRS. But whether they do it or not, you're not going to give your form to IRS. But you're supposed to tell them that. There's a form that they sign, and you give them. I think it's anything over. Was everything over $50 they had to sign for? We always had money. If we needed to do something, we had money. There was different funding. We call them funding sites. If you were doing an operation, a counterintelligence operation, and you needed, $5,000 for this, then they would give us a number. Okay, it's under this site, and somebody would deposit it in a bank here, and we would use that money, or they would give us vouchers or something to that effect. But there would be different funding sources. I'm not sure where they came from. I'm sure all government funding, someplace up there. Congress appropriates the funds, and there's a lot of black projects and black funding, so I'm sure we got a piece of that.
So I was just getting ready to ask you about Bechtel Corporation, the involvement you had with them or their involvement with this subject.
Bechtel was in charge of security and operations at a number of facilities, including the Nevada test site, and one of their chief security officers was a former colleague of mine who worked at Kirtland with me. And Bechtel, there was a lot of experiments done at the Nevada test site, which is, of course, now the Nevada National Security Site, regarding UFO research of alien reverse engineering. Well, they were trying to. I think Sandia Labs had a project, had funding to delve into this time travel, whether you could go back in time or forward in time. And they built facilities out there to test different things. Huge magnets. I think they had one of the underground magnets, and they were shooting lasers and things through them, trying to open up a fabric of space in order to do time travel. And I watched a number of those things. I was briefed on a counterintelligence project out there, but I don't know whatever the outcome of it was. I don't know if they ever figured it out or not.
How about any experiments did you hear of or come across experiments dealing with so-called teleportation or moving across space in a nonlinear way?
That was part of this project that they were doing out there. They actually, I think, teleported something from one end of a table to the other. I think that's the best they ever did. But and maybe that's all I know. Maybe they did more that I wasn't aware of.
But you had knowledge of that?
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
I actually saw a craft flying above Groom Lake that did things that you couldn't do with a conventional aircraft. Speeding, going 1,400 miles an hour and stopping and changing angles, and then going straight up and stopping and coming back down. And this is a big aircraft. This was one of these oval-shaped alien crafts that they were testing out there. And this was in '87. I don't, you can look at it and you could just tell, but just conventionally, because common sense tells you that how do they do this stuff? It can't be a conventional craft. They can't use conventional means to do this. has to be anti-gravity or something, because it would kill a pilot. I mean, I had a pilot standing next to me who had been a fighter pilot for years, flew F-106s, and he told me there's no way in the world a pilot could have survived that.
The G-force.
The G-forces, yeah. And stopping. He said, accelerating isn't bad, but you got to stop. When you stop, it's going to break your body to pieces.
Oh, yeah. Your nose will, your brains will come out of your nose.
Exactly, yeah.
I know this.
So that's one of the weird things I saw that just not explainable. I can't figure out it.
Were there human pilots on board? Or
I never saw it land, so I don't know. I don't
Did
know
you
if
ever
there was
meet an Air Force pilot who piloted them?
only the Cash Lander. I actually interviewed him.
Oh, you
Or
did?
there were 4 of them. I mean, there was the 2 pilots. There was a systems officer that was handling the equipment, and then there was I can't remember what the 4th person did. He was a navigator or what he was, and I interviewed them, and everything that could have gone wrong. It took off fine from Nevada and flew perfectly, but when it was going to an air base. I can't remember which air base it was. Some air base in Texas. I think it was Webb Air Force Base in Big Springs. I think it was. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was Webb. And when they tried to slow it down, that's when the problems happened. And then they cut power, and so many things went wrong that they almost crashed. They called for rescue helicopters because they thought we were going to crash. So these helicopters came out, but they finally got it going again, and they landed at some place. Apparently, it was just past where they spurred all this radiation on those 2 poor people, or 3 people, or however many it were, and then they flew it back to Nevada. It was pretty huge. It was one of those big ones. It was not a saucer shaped. It was more of a huge oval shape.
Was it man-made?
It was reverse engineered.
Reverse engineered,
Yeah.
yes.
They trained 9 months before they ever flew it. And then they trained another, I can't remember how long, 4 or 5 months, flying it all around Nevada. And it worked fine. But the problem is it's a reverse engineered alien craft with one of our nuclear propulsion systems. That wasn't refined because they couldn't figure out how to reverse engineer the aliens. They got it to work at times, but they couldn't manipulate it the way they needed to for a human pilot to fly it. So they had to put one of our propulsion system in it, and it malfunctioned. And they trained, and there wasn't any. The pilot told me they were flying, and everything seemed. They were flying at a high altitude. I can't remember what altitude it was. Flying perfectly fine, no problems whatsoever, until they slowed down. He said, and then hell broke loose. Then the system just malfunctioned, and they had this something that was supposed to throw thrust, but the thruster was moving all around, and they had a filter, some kind of filter that was supposed to filter. That didn't work. That didn't come down, and it was just a mess.
Do you know what kind of velocities this craft reached?
It could go Mach 1. And I that's all I was told. I mean, maybe probably more than that, but just what he told me, or the pilot told me when I interviewed him, was he had it up to Mach 1.
It sounds like a hybrid craft. It had some aspects of the ET craft and others
Yeah.
of the conventional.
Yeah, the body and everything was ET. The only thing that was propulsion was it was us, with American and or conventional, or actually a nuclear, and it just didn't work.
And there were 4 humans.
Yeah, four humans in it, and none of them suffered any radiation problems.
Good.
It's just those poor people on the ground.
I really want to thank you.
You're welcome.
You're doing great information.
You're very
I
welcome.
really appreciate your help.